Hello, everyone. Welcome to session one, coming from Joshua chapter 3, God leading his people. Repackaging this with the title of The Exodus Ends as the Corporate Adam Enters Eden. So we've been working together long enough that you hopefully understand what I mean by corporate Adam. That's Israel. Exodus 19:6, that you will be my kingdom of priests, that echoing back to Genesis chapters 1 and 2, when in Genesis 1, Adam is coronated as king. Genesis 2, he is commissioned as a priest. That Adam, of course, rebelled against the Lord, and then God, as that experiment is moved further down the stream toward Noah, and then eventually Abram, who was called in Genesis 12, and then the descendants of Abram who are going to change the world, per Genesis chapter 12, verse 3, they are now standing in the moment, receiving that commission in Exodus 19 to be that kingdom of priests. But the Exodus continues to linger. They are not yet in Canaan when they are standing at Sinai, receiving that commission, and they are not meant to be outside of Canaan for the next 40 years, but that happens. So as they linger outside the land, and that generation that rebelled, chose not to enter into the land, have all passed away, and now Moses himself is gone. Joshua is the one who is taking over and is going to lead the people into Eden. So that's what we're staging for. The first three chapters of Joshua are giving us a glimpse into that as they are still on the eastern side of the Jordan River in the land of Moab, looking across at Jordan, where they will, the Jordan at Jericho, where they will eventually wind up going in to conquer. So, a few things I want to point out here. Clearly, in 10 minutes, I don't have time to go through all of this, but I think it's important for us to frame up for our students from the first two chapters how the writer of Joshua is helping us appreciate Joshua's ministry as the leader of Israel. That he is not just simply the one who has come to replace Moses, but is an altogether new Moses. And then I would say it's important for us to go back to Deuteronomy chapter 18, where Moses promises that the Lord will raise up from among their own brethren a prophet like Moses, and that the Lord will put his words into that prophet's mouth and they will listen to him. And if they don't, they will be cut off. Most of us are aware of the fact that Jesus is ultimately the end point of that and the complete total fulfillment of that. But for the centuries that intervene between the time Moses spoke that until Jesus, every prophet who winds up being raised up to speak, every judge who rules, every king who rules, in essence, is taking parts of Moses's ministry. But the prophet, of course, is the most eminent person of that because he's the one who gets the chance to peer into the divine counsel of God and the one whom God fills his mouth with his words. And the kings and the priests who continue to administrate and lead liturgically Israel's religious celebrations and so forth are only sharing in parts of what Moses did collectively, having all three of those offices embodied into his one person. So that being said, we go back to Joshua 1:9. God promises he'll be with Joshua as he told Moses he would be with him at the burning bush. So again, I think it's important for us to put our minds and then the minds of our students into that gear of, okay, these stories are stylized for a reason. The entire Torah is stylized in such a way that the stories that are given to us are removing decades and in some cases centuries worth of history to connect each of these stories in relatively close sequence for us to appreciate how humans are interacting with God and God with humans in spite of their failures and progressing the experiment of what he started in Eden, moving that forward through the people and then eventually the persons that he chooses to ultimately bring success and his glory to fill the earth as the water fills the sea. So it's not just to say, well, God's promising that he'll be with Joshua the same as he will be with Moses. And then, of course, we can take this as a personal application. Yes, you can, but that's not the first order rendering of this. That's something that's supposed to be understood further on down the line through the process of interpreting. Rather, the first concept that we must appreciate is how the generations of Israelites who would read these accounts in the years after they passed would understand that Joshua was purposefully raised up by the Lord as part of his plan to finish the Exodus sequence and the conquest era, right? Then we have this instance here where 3 days they will be crossing the Jordan. This is what Joshua tells the Israelites. Now, it's important for us to appreciate this is one of those very intentional hyperlinks that's embedded into the text that ripples back to previous stories in Torah. The first sequence of this is in Genesis chapter 22 with Abraham sacrificing Isaac. And remember, anytime we see this 3 day formula here. There's the built-in Exodus or exile Exodus sequence that Isaac was exiled to death, but he is given the Exodus or resurrection from the dead, per se, by him having his bonds cut loose, and he's allowed to rise up off the altar where he was consigned to his death. Now you're like, well, how does that factor into the story of Joshua? Well, we walk it through the story of the Exodus, where when Israel has been led out of Egypt and now they're at Sinai, Moses tells them on the third day they are to be consecrated fully because God is going to come down. They are still in the Exodus phase at this point. They've not yet reached the land of their inheritance, but God is going to dwell with them. They've been in exile in Egypt. They are in exile in the wilderness, yet God is going to purposefully meet with them almost the same way he did with Adam and Eve in the garden. And God is going to speak with them as he did with Adam and Eve in the garden. And he's going to share wisdom with them, right? So God has brought a race of people that he has carved out to be his own unto himself, as he made Adam and Eve outside the garden, but brought them into the garden. And Joshua is saying here, this Exodus is about to officially come to its end. 3 days from this moment, after they've consecrated themselves, God is going to lead them processionally into Jordan. We go on to see how Joshua commissions spies, the same way that Moses commissioned spies to go into the land of Canaan, although this is an inversion of that. Sometimes these paradigms will do that. They'll take a point and they'll completely flip it upside down to show us a different angle of what God is doing here that makes this instance of this repeated pattern different, and how this story is advancing forward to get closer to the objective God is ultimately trying to achieve. Because that group of 12 spies Moses commissioned, 10 of them decided that they would corrupt everyone else and align them with their plight to go back to Egypt and reject the Exodus. Whereas Joshua sent 2 spies who, in spite of great peril to their own persons and the possibility they might die in this mission, yet they went out and they faithfully executed the mission. And as they come back, in spite of the fact that Jericho is completely walled up and all of his defenses are seemingly airtight, they're ready for battle. Yet these men are not bringing a message of fear and cowering, but rather a message of victory, that God indeed has already went before them. I could go on here, but I want to just draw attention to the last and final one here, and that was the instruction given to Rahab here, that she was to keep her family firmly pent up inside her house when the moment of Jericho's destruction comes about. Because if anyone leaves the house, then if they are killed in the process of the city crumbling or the Israelites coming in and putting everyone to the sword, then Israel will not be responsible for their blood. But if they remain in the house, then they will be responsible for breaking the covenant. And also they are to tie this scarlet cord to the window. That very closely mimics what happened the night of the Passover, when Moses gave the same instructions. Everyone is to paint the doorposts and lintel with the blood of a goat or a lamb, and then go inside their house, shut themselves in after eating the Passover meal, and do not come out until morning. They're not allowed outside their houses. If they walk out underneath that bloodstained door and they're caught outside and the destroyer comes, they too may die. So that is probably one of the closest parallels between this story of Moses that's drawn out over nearly 3.5 books of Torah and 40 years from the time he leaves Midian to go back to Egypt. And yet, what we also have here in the first 2 chapters of Joshua is a complete rehashing of the story of Moses almost in many of these close points of parallel. And then we get into chapter 3, where we have Joshua telling the people, as Moses told the people at Sinai, consecrate yourselves. In 3 days, God's going to descend on the mountain. Now Joshua says, consecrate yourselves because the Lord is going to do wonders among you in parting the Jordan River, as Moses saw and was the conduit by which God exercised power to part the Red Sea. And this perhaps is probably one of the strongest points of affiliation. So why are these stories so closely intertwined? Well, it's to show that Joshua is a replacement Moses, for a lack of better term and a bit of a rudimentary way of saying it here. It's important for us to appreciate that and for help our students appreciate that. And then lastly, I would leave you here with the idea that Yahweh is the first to enter the land as the triumphant king. The ark in this instance is kind of seen as his chariot throne, that he is the one who is destroying the dark powers in the land. It doesn't happen immediately as he walks in. Ultimately, that can't stand against God. So there's really no challenge here, but it's the fact that God is parting the sea as he had parted the creation waters that allow dry land to come forth. He parted the waters again when he allowed new dry land to come forth in the flood of Noah's day. He parts the sea, which in Hebrew is Yam Suf when we're talking about the Red Sea. And of course, the ancient chaotic god that often is presented as a dragon of sorts is Yam within the Canaanite mythology, of which Baal is the chief deity of that pantheon of gods. And that God defeats Yam in not only parting the Red Sea for them to part through, but yet again, that motif is echoed here with respect to parting the Jordan River. Now, that's important because it's showing that God is always ordering creation for his people, bringing about new creation from the darkness of exile. And that is happening at this climactic moment when they're taking the land for themselves, as was promised. But because God is the triumphant king and he is the one that squashes his enemies, the dark powers that oppose him, the land is holy, and Israel is only allowed to remain there as occupants if they are faithful and loyal to their end of the bargain and obeying God's law. So I hope that's helpful. And by the time that you get to the 30-minute breakdown, I hope that some of this will have made a bit more sense. But tune in for the next lesson, and we'll be discussing the next portion of Joshua.